Sarah Jenkins stared at the polished wooden floors of courtroom 302, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she waited for her case to be called. The large clock on the wall ticked slowly, marking each passing minute in the busy traffic court. At just 17 years old, she felt out of place among the adults who filled the hard wooden benches. It was a typical Tuesday morning in downtown Atlanta, and Sarah had arrived an hour early, dressed in her most professional outfit, a navy blue blazer, crisp white blouse, and knee-length skirt. Her mother had helped her pick it out the night before, wanting to ensure her daughter made the best possible impression. The weight of her backpack, filled with legal documents and research materials, pressed against her legs. The courtroom buzzed with quiet conversations and the shuffling of papers. Sarah observed everything with keen interest, though her expression remained neutral. She'd always been this way, quiet, observant, taking in every detail while others often mistook her silence for timidity or lack of engagement. 2 rows ahead, a man in a wrinkled suit argued loudly with his wife about their parking ticket. To her right, an elderly woman dozed off, her cane propped against the bench. The court officer stationed by the door maintained a stern expression, occasionally calling for order when voices rose too high. Sarah's mind wandered to the events that had brought her here. 3 weeks ago, she received a jaywalking ticket while rushing to catch her bus after staying late at the school library. The officer had been unnecessarily harsh, refusing to listen to her explanation about the malfunctioning crosswalk signal. Rather than simply paying the $150 fine, she decided to challenge it. Her parents had been surprised by her determination. "Just pay the ticket, honey," her mother had suggested. "It's not worth missing school for." But Sarah knew it wasn't about the money. It was about principle, about standing up for what was right. She'd spent countless hours in the local law library, researching similar cases and studying municipal codes. The morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the courtroom. Sarah pulled out her notebook, reviewing her carefully prepared notes one last time. Her hands trembled slightly, but her mind remained sharp and focused. Years of academic excellence had taught her how to channel her nervousness into determination. Few people knew that behind her quiet exterior lay an extraordinary mind. Sarah had joined Mensa at age 12, achieving one of the highest scores in her state. Now, in her senior year of high school, she was already taking advanced courses at Emory Law School through a special program for gifted students. But she never bragged about her achievements, preferring to let her work speak for itself. The court clerk, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses perched on her nose, shuffled through a stack of papers. "Next case, Jenkins, Sarah. Violation code 40-691, she called out in a monotone voice. Sarah gathered her materials and stood up, her heart pounding but her face composed. As she walked toward the defendant's table, she could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her. She was used to being underestimated, the quiet black girl who barely spoke up in class, who preferred books to parties, who spent her weekends studying rather than socializing. Judge Richard Harrison sat high above on his bench, barely glancing up from his papers as Sarah approached. His reputation for being tough on young defendants was well known, and today he looked particularly irritated. She could hear him muttering under his breath about another teenage troublemaker wasting the court's time. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sarah placed her documents on the table before her. She straightened her spine, remembering her mother's words from that morning. "Stand tall, baby girl. Don't let anyone make you feel small." The courtroom settled into silence as Judge Harrison finally looked up, his eyes narrowing as they fell on Sarah. She met his gaze steadily, despite the butterflies in her stomach. This was the moment she had prepared for, and she was ready to prove that appearances could be deceiving. Little did anyone in that courtroom know, including the dismissive judge, that they were about to witness something extraordinary. The quiet girl standing before them, who many had already written off as just another nervous teenager, was about to challenge their preconceptions in ways they never expected. Judge Harrison shuffled through his papers, barely concealing his impatience as he looked down at Sarah. The morning had already been long, filled with what he considered trivial cases, and his mood had steadily soured. The sight of yet another teenager in his courtroom did nothing to improve his disposition. "Case number 2374, Sarah Jenkins, jaywalking violation," he announced, his voice carrying a hint of condescension. "Young lady, do you understand why you're here today?" His tone suggested he was speaking to a child rather than a high school senior. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but the judge continued before she could speak. Because in my experience, most young people these days don't seem to understand basic traffic laws. They're too busy with their phones and their social media to pay attention to their surroundings. A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The judge seemed encouraged by this response, leaning back in his chair with a self-satisfied smile. Well, do you have anything to say for yourself? Speak up, girl. The court can't hear mumbling. Sarah hadn't actually said anything yet, but the judge's assumption about her communication skills was clear. She stood perfectly still, her posture straight, hands clasped in front of her. The quiet dignity of her bearing seemed to irritate the judge even more. Perhaps we should call your parents, Judge Harrison suggested, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Is there an adult who can speak on your behalf? Because I'm not seeing much evidence that you're capable of defending yourself here. The court clerk shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly uncomfortable with the judge's tone. Even the court officer by the door frowned slightly, though he maintained his professional stance. Your Honor, Sarah began softly. Speak up, the judge interrupted, tapping his gavel impatiently. This is a courtroom, not a library. If you can't project your voice, maybe you shouldn't be here wasting the court's time. More laughter echoed through the courtroom. A middle-aged man in the gallery whispered loudly to his companion. Kids these days have no respect. The judge nodded in agreement, as if the comment validated his behavior. Sarah remained composed, though her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her folder. She'd faced this kind of prejudice before. People who confused her quietness with weakness, her reserve with lack of intelligence. Each snicker and dismissive comment only strengthened her resolve. I see here you're contesting a simple jaywalking ticket, Judge Harrison continued, squinting at the papers before him. Crossed against the light, according to the officer's report. Pretty straightforward case. He peered at her over his reading glasses. Unless you have some compelling reason why we shouldn't proceed with the fine. Something more substantial than I was late for the bus, or everyone else was doing it. The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. He was playing to the gallery now, clearly enjoying his role as the stern authority figure putting a presumably rebellious teenager in her place. You know, in my day, he began, settling in for what was clearly a familiar lecture, young people respected the law. They understood consequences. Now it seems like every teenager thinks they're above the rules. They think they know better than police officers, better than judges even. Sarah stood patiently, waiting for her opportunity to speak. Her research materials were organized neatly before her, but the judge hadn't even acknowledged them. His assumptions about her had been made the moment she walked into his courtroom. Well? He prompted again, his irritation growing with her continued silence. Do you have anything to say in your defense? Or should we just proceed with the fine and stop wasting everyone's time? The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Most observers probably expected Sarah to mumble an apology and accept her punishment. That's what the judge clearly anticipated, based on the way he was already reaching for his gavel. But Sarah remained steady, her eyes clear and focused. She had prepared meticulously for this moment, and no amount of mockery or dismissal would deter her. As she finally opened her mouth to speak, no one in that courtroom, least of all Judge Harrison, was prepared for what was about to happen. The quiet girl they had all underestimated was about to show them exactly why appearances could be deceiving, and why justice should never be dispensed based on prejudice and assumptions. Your Honor. Sarah began again, her voice soft but clear as crystal. I would appreciate the opportunity to present my case. The simple statement, delivered with quiet confidence, caused Judge Harrison to pause mid-reach for his gavel. Well then, by all means, he said, gesturing dramatically. Enlighten us. But speak up, I can barely hear you over the sound of my own thoughts. More snickers echoed through the courtroom. Sarah straightened her shoulders and took a deep breath. Your Honor, I'm here today to contest citation number 40 to 691, issued on January 15th. However, before I present my defense, I would like to address a procedural matter. The judge's eyebrows rose slightly. He hadn't expected such formal language from the quiet teenager before him. Procedural matter? He repeated, his tone mocking. My, someone's been watching too many legal dramas. Sarah continued undeterred. According to Georgia Municipal Court Rules of Procedure, Section 17.3, Any defendant has the right to be heard without interruption or mockery from the bench. I believe the court record will show that since I entered this courtroom, I've been interrupted 4 times and haven't been allowed to complete the single sentence. A sudden hush fell over the courtroom. The judge's face reddened slightly, but Sarah wasn't finished. Furthermore, Your Honor, the Georgia Code of Judicial Conduct, Canon 2, Rule 2.8b, specifically states that a judge shall be patient, dignified, and courteous to litigants. I respectfully submit that your comments about my age, speaking ability, and presumed intelligence violate this canon. Judge Harrison's face had gone from red to purple. The court clerk had stopped pretending to shuffle papers and was staring openly at Sarah. The previously amused spectators sat in stunned silence. "Young lady," the judge began, his voice dangerously low, "are you presuming to lecture me about judicial conduct in my own courtroom?" "No, Your Honor," Sarah replied calmly. "I'm merely establishing the legal framework within which I wish to present my defense. Would you like me to cite the relevant precedents regarding judicial behavior toward pro se defendants? I have copies of 3 controlling cases from the Georgia Supreme Court." The judge leaned forward, studying Sarah with new interest. Gone was the dismissive smirk, replaced by a look of growing uncertainty. "Who exactly are you?" he demanded. "I am exactly who I appear to be, Your Honor. A high school senior who received an incorrect citation and wishes to present a legal defense based on both procedural and substantive grounds." Sarah opened her folder and removed several neatly organized documents. "I prepared a brief analyzing the relevant statutes and case law. I have diagrams showing the malfunctioning crosswalk signal, sworn statements from 2 witnesses, and photographs documenting the scene. I also have maintenance records showing that the pedestrian signal in question had been reported faulty 3 times in the week before my citation." The silence in the courtroom had become absolute. Even the usual shuffling of papers and creaking of chairs had ceased. All eyes were fixed on the young woman who had transformed from a seemingly timid teenager into what appeared to be a seasoned legal professional. Judge Harrison cleared his throat. "Ms. Jenkins, are you represented by counsel?" He glanced around the courtroom as if expecting a lawyer to jump up and claim responsibility for this surprising display. "No, Your Honor, I'm appearing pro se. However, I've thoroughly researched the relevant laws and procedures. Would you like me to proceed with my defense, or shall we continue discussing my ability to speak in court?" The subtle challenge in her question wasn't lost on anyone. A few spectators quickly covered their mouths to hide their smiles. The same middle-aged man who had criticized her earlier was now leaning forward intently, clearly fascinated by this unexpected turn of events. Judge Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The power dynamic in his courtroom had shifted dramatically in just a few minutes. He glanced at the court reporter, who was typing furiously, then back at Sarah. "Proceed with your defense, Miss Jenkins," he said, his tone notably more respectful. "The court is listening." Sarah nodded graciously, but before she could begin her main argument, she was about to reveal something that would make her command of legal procedures seem like a minor surprise in comparison. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice growing slightly stronger, "before I present my defense regarding the jaywalking citation, I believe it's important to establish my credentials, as they are relevant to understanding the technical aspects of my argument." The judge nodded, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine curiosity. Sarah reached into her folder and pulled out several official-looking documents. "I am currently ranked first in my class at Hamilton High School, with a 4.0 GPA. More relevantly, I'm enrolled in the Advanced Legal Studies program at Emory Law School, where I attend classes 3 evenings per week through their Gifted Youth Initiative." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Judge Harrison's eyes widened slightly as he examined the documentation Sarah had provided to the clerk. Additionally, Sarah continued, "I spent the past 2 summers interning at the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, where I assisted in researching traffic law enforcement patterns across multiple jurisdictions." The judge leaned forward, his reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose. "These credentials are impressive, Ms. Jenkins, but what bearing do they have on a simple jaywalking citation?" Sarah smiled slightly for the first time that morning. "They establish my familiarity with both traffic law and civil rights legislation, Your Honor. Because this isn't just about jaywalking. It's about the selective enforcement of pedestrian safety laws and the failure of municipal authorities to maintain crucial safety equipment. She pulled out a series of photographs and diagrams, presenting them to the court clerk. These images, taken within hours of my citation, clearly show the malfunctioning crosswalk signal at the intersection of Maple and 4th Street. The pedestrian button was non-responsive, and the walk signal remained red despite the traffic light cycle. Sarah then produced a thick stack of maintenance reports. I filed a Freedom of Information Act request and discovered that this particular crossing signal had been reported faulty 17 times in the past 3 months. The city had failed to make repairs despite numerous complaints. The courtroom was completely silent now, hanging on her every word. Even the bailiff had abandoned his usual stoic expression and was watching with obvious interest. Furthermore, Sarah continued, her voice growing more confident, I've analyzed 6 months of jaywalking citations issued at this intersection. The data shows a disturbing pattern of selective enforcement, with 73% of citations being issued to minority pedestrians, despite demographic data showing they represent only 31% of the foot traffic in that area. Judge Harrison sat up straighter, his expression now deadly serious. What had started as a simple traffic court case was rapidly evolving into something far more significant. Your Honor, while I acknowledge that jaywalking is indeed a violation of municipal code, I contend that my actions were necessitated by the city's negligence in maintaining essential safety equipment. The non-functioning crosswalk signal created an unsafe condition that forced pedestrians to make judgment calls about crossing. Sarah pulled out one final document. I prepared a brief analyzing similar cases where citations were dismissed due to malfunctioning traffic control devices. The controlling case is Thompson v. City of Atlanta, where the court held that citizens cannot be penalized for reasonable actions taken in response to failed municipal infrastructure. The judge removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, clearly processing the transformation of what he'd expected to be a routine morning in traffic court. Ms. Jenkins, are you planning to challenge the constitutionality of our jaywalking enforcement policies? Only if necessary, Your Honor. Sarah replied diplomatically. My primary argument focuses on the specific circumstances of my citation. However, I'm prepared to escalate this to a broader constitutional challenge if the court feels it's appropriate. The spectators in the gallery exchanged impressed glances. The same people who had laughed at her earlier were now watching with a mixture of awe and respect. Before we proceed further, Sarah added, reaching for another folder, I have one more piece of information that I believe the court should consider. She paused, making eye contact with Judge Harrison, who now looked both intrigued and slightly apprehensive about what other surprises this remarkable young woman might have in store. The judge gestured for her to continue, his earlier condescension completely forgotten. The quiet girl he had mocked was about to reveal something that would make her legal expertise seem like just the tip of the iceberg. Sarah withdrew a single document from her folder, her hand steady as she handed it to the court clerk. Your Honor, I'd like to submit my Mensa certification for the record. I was admitted at age 12 with an IQ of 165, placing me in the top 0.1 percentile globally. A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. Judge Harrison took the document, his hands slightly trembling as he read it. The smirk that had dominated his face earlier had completely vanished. This certification, Sarah continued, is relevant because it demonstrates my capacity to analyze complex situations rapidly, which directly relates to the split-second decision I had to make at that crosswalk. When faced with a malfunctioning signal and an approaching bus, my only transportation to my evening law classes at Emory, I made a calculated decision based on traffic patterns and visibility conditions. The judge cleared his throat. Ms. Jenkins, are you currently the youngest member of Mensa in the state? Yes, Your Honor. I also serve on their youth advisory board and have published 3 papers in their quarterly journal about the intersection of artificial intelligence and constitutional law. Sarah's voice remained modest, despite the extraordinary achievements she was describing. The court clerk had stopped pretending to work, her pen frozen mid-air as she stared at Sarah with undisguised admiration. The spectators who had laughed at her earlier now looked thoroughly embarrassed. Additionally, Sarah continued, I've been invited to speak at several international conferences about accelerated learning and cognitive development. However, I often decline these invitations because they conflict with my volunteer work at the local legal aid clinic, where I help elderly residents navigate traffic court procedures. Judge Harrison removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," he said slowly. "You're simultaneously a high school senior, a law school student, a Mensa member, a legal researcher, and a volunteer advocate." "Yes, Your Honor. And I also tutor third-grade students in mathematics on weekends." Sarah added this last detail almost apologetically, as if concerned it might seem like showing off. The middle-aged man who had criticized her earlier leaned over to his companion and whispered, "My kid's biggest achievement this week was learning to make toast without burning it." "Your Honor," Sarah pressed on, "I mention these accomplishments not to boast, but to establish a pattern of rational decision-making and ethical behavior. When I encountered that malfunctioning crosswalk signal, I applied the same analytical skills I use in my academic and volunteer work to make the safest possible choice under the circumstances." The judge was now leaning forward, completely engaged. "And what exactly was your thought process in that moment, Ms. Jenkins?" "I observed that the vehicle traffic was completely stopped. The signal had been non-responsive for over 3 minutes, and my bus, the last one of the evening, was approaching. I calculated the risks, factored in the lighting conditions and visibility, and made an informed decision to cross. I would argue that this represents exactly the kind of reasonable judgment that our legal system should encourage, not penalize." The transformation in the courtroom was complete. The same people who had snickered at her silence now sat in awe of her eloquence. The court officer, who had maintained a stern expression throughout the morning, was now openly smiling. Judge Harrison set down his gavel and folded his hands. "Ms. Jenkins, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your capabilities based on superficial observations, and in doing so, I violated one of the most fundamental principles of justice, that we must look beyond appearances to find truth." Sarah nodded graciously, but she wasn't finished. There was one more revelation she had saved for this moment, one that would challenge not just the judge's assumptions about her, but about the entire system of justice he represented. The afternoon sun streamed through the courthouse windows, casting a warm glow over the proceedings. What had started as a simple traffic court session had evolved into something far more significant, a powerful lesson about prejudice, intelligence, and the danger of underestimating quiet voices. As Sarah prepared to deliver her final point, the entire courtroom leaned forward in anticipation. The quiet girl they had dismissed was about to challenge their understanding of justice itself. "Your Honor," Sarah said, pulling out one final document from her folder, "I've saved the most crucial piece of evidence for last. During my research, I discovered something that affects not just my case, but potentially hundreds of others." She presented a detailed statistical analysis, complete with graphs and charts. "Over the past year, I've compiled data on every jaywalking citation issued within a 5-mile radius of this intersection. The pattern reveals something disturbing about our traffic enforcement system." Judge Harrison studied the documents with growing concern. The courtroom remained silent as Sarah began explaining her findings. "The data shows that citations for jaywalking at malfunctioning crosswalks are issued 3 times more frequently in predominantly minority neighborhoods. Furthermore, the average response time for signal repairs in these areas is 47 days, compared to just 72 hours in other parts of the city." The judge's face grew increasingly serious as he flipped through the pages. "These statistics, where did you obtain this information?" "All of this data comes from public records, Your Honor. I spent 6 months submitting FOIA requests, cross-referencing maintenance logs, and analyzing citation patterns. I also interviewed over 50 residents who received similar citations at malfunctioning crosswalks." Sarah then produced a series of sworn affidavits. These statements come from other citizens who encountered the same non-functioning signal. Many of them paid their fines without contest, simply because they lacked the resources or knowledge to challenge the citations. The court clerk had stopped even pretending to maintain professional detachment, her mouth slightly open as she listened. Even the most jaded regulars in the gallery were hanging on every word. "Your Honor," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger, "my case today isn't just about one jaywalking ticket. It's about a systemic failure to maintain essential infrastructure and the disproportionate impact this has on certain communities. The very fact that I'm able to stand here and present this evidence makes me one of the fortunate ones." Judge Harrison removed his glasses, rubbing his temples thoughtfully. "Ms. Jenkins, are you suggesting that this represents a pattern of institutional bias?" "The data speaks for itself, Your Honor. But more importantly, it speaks for those who couldn't be here today. The single parent who paid the fine rather than miss work to contest it. The elderly resident who couldn't navigate the legal system. The student who couldn't afford to take time off from their job." Sarah's quiet confidence had transformed into passionate advocacy, though her voice remained measured and respectful. "This crosswalk signal isn't just a malfunctioning piece of equipment. It's a symbol of larger systemic issues that need to be addressed." The judge leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah with new respect. "You've turned what appeared to be a simple traffic violation into a compelling civil rights issue. I have to ask, why go to all this trouble? You could have simply paid the fine." Sarah straightened her shoulders. "Because, Your Honor, justice shouldn't depend on one's ability to present a sophisticated legal argument. If I can use my privileges, my education, my research skills, my access to resources, to highlight these inequities, then I have a responsibility to do so." The courtroom had grown so quiet that you could hear the tick of the wall clock. The same spectators who had laughed at Sarah's silence earlier now sat in thoughtful reflection. "Ms. Jenkins," Judge Harrison said, "you've presented not just a defense of your actions, but a challenge to the entire system. Your evidence suggests problems that extend far beyond this courtroom." "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied. "And I have one final piece of information to share. Something that connects all of these dots and demonstrates why this case could set an important precedent for future citations." The judge nodded, gesturing for her to continue. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtroom floor as Sarah prepared to deliver her final revelation. The quiet girl who had been mocked and dismissed was about to demonstrate why being underestimated could sometimes be the greatest advantage of all. As she reached for her final exhibit, everyone in the courtroom held their breath, knowing they were witnessing something extraordinary. A moment when justice and intelligence combined to challenge the status quo in ways no one had expected when the day began. Sarah withdrew her final piece of evidence, a thin blue folder that had remained untouched until now. "Your Honor, while researching this case, I discovered something that directly affects your jurisdiction over these types of citations." She handed the document to the clerk, who quickly passed it to Judge Harrison. As he began reading, his eyebrows rose steadily higher. "According to Municipal Code Section 457.3, Sarah explained, any traffic citation issued at an intersection with documented equipment failure must first be reviewed by the City Transportation Safety Board before being brought to court. This requirement was added as an amendment 6 months ago, but it appears to have been overlooked in practice." Judge Harrison studied the document intently. "Are you suggesting that this court lacks proper jurisdiction over these cases?" "Yes, Your Honor. Not just for my citation, but for every similar case in the past 6 months. None of these tickets should have been processed without prior review. The law was designed specifically to prevent citations from being issued at known malfunctioning signals." The judge set down the document and removed his glasses slowly. The transformation in his demeanor was complete, from condescending authority figure to humble public servant. "Ms. Jenkins," he began, his voice carrying a new note of respect, "I've been presiding over traffic court for 15 years. Not once has anyone brought this regulation to my attention. Not the city prosecutors, not the defense attorneys, not even my own clerks." Sarah nodded respectfully. "The amendment was buried in a larger transportation bill, Your Honor. It's easy to miss if you're not specifically looking for it. I only found it because I was researching every possible aspect of traffic signal regulations." The judge turned to the court clerk. "Ms. Thompson, how many similar citations have we processed in the past 6 months?" The clerk quickly consulted her computer. "Approximately 375, Your Honor." A low murmur spread through the courtroom as the implications became clear. Judge Harrison raised his hand for silence. "Ms. Jenkins, do you realize what you've uncovered here? This could invalidate hundreds of citations. The city might be liable for refunding thousands of dollars in fines." "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied quietly. "That's precisely why I felt compelled to bring this to the court's attention. It's not just about my case anymore." Judge Harrison stood up, something he rarely did during traffic court. In light of this information, I have no choice but to dismiss your citation. Furthermore, I am ordering an immediate review of all similar cases from the past 6 months. He turned to address the entire courtroom. I want to thank Ms. Jenkins not just for her extraordinary preparation, but for reminding us that justice requires us to look beyond our preconceptions. When I first saw a quiet young woman enter my courtroom, I made assumptions that were not only incorrect but unprofessional. Sarah remained standing, her posture straight but humble. The judge continued, I am officially entering a ruling that will require review of all crosswalk citations issued at intersections with reported signal malfunctions. Ms. Jenkins, would you be willing to share your research with the court to help facilitate this review? Of course, Your Honor. I've already prepared digital copies of all my findings. The spectators in the gallery, many of whom had their own traffic citations to contest, broke into spontaneous applause. The court officer made a half-hearted attempt to restore order, but even he was smiling. Judge Harrison banged his gavel, not to silence the applause but to make his final statement official. This court stands adjourned. Ms. Jenkins, please remain behind to speak with the clerk about submitting your research into the official record. As people began filing out of the courtroom, many stopped to congratulate Sarah or shake her hand. The same individuals who had laughed at her silence earlier now sought her advice about their own cases. But Sarah's work wasn't finished. As she gathered her materials, she knew this was just the beginning of a larger conversation about justice, equality, and the importance of questioning established systems. The afternoon sun streamed through the courthouse windows, illuminating the young woman who had transformed from a seemingly timid teenager into a powerful advocate for change. And as Judge Harrison watched her from his bench, he realized that this quiet girl had taught him one of the most important lessons of his career, that justice often speaks softest just before it roars. The story of what happened in courtroom 302 spread quickly through the city's legal community. Within days, local news stations were requesting interviews with Sarah. Sarah sat in her family's living room, watching as the evening news played clips from her court appearance. The camera had captured the moment Judge Harrison dismissed her case and announced the review of hundreds of similar citations. Our daughter, Sarah's mother said proudly to the reporter, has always been quiet but determined. When she believes in something, she puts her whole heart into it. Her father sat beside her, beaming with pride as he watched his daughter being interviewed. The impact of Sarah's case extended far beyond that single courtroom victory. The city council called an emergency session to address the issues she had uncovered. Judge Harrison himself testified about the need for reform in traffic court procedures. What Ms. Jenkins brought to light, the judge told the council members, wasn't just a technical oversight. It was a wake-up call about how we administer justice in this city. Within weeks, the city began implementing changes. A new review process was established for all traffic citations involving malfunctioning equipment. The Transportation Department created an expedited repair schedule for traffic signals in all neighborhoods, regardless of location. Sarah's research became required reading for incoming traffic court judges. Her statistical analysis of citation patterns led to mandatory training on bias awareness for all traffic enforcement officers. But perhaps the most significant change came from the quiet students who had been inspired by her example. At Hamilton High School, Sarah's classmates started a legal rights awareness club, with Sarah serving as their advisor. The club helped students understand their rights and navigate the legal system. What Sarah taught us, one club member explained, is that being quiet doesn't mean being powerless. Sometimes the strongest voices are the ones that take time to gather evidence before speaking. Local law firms began offering internships specifically targeted at students interested in civil rights and traffic law. Sarah was invited to help design the program, ensuring it would be accessible to students from all backgrounds. The city's traffic court transformed as well. Judge Harrison instituted new procedures requiring judges to hear all evidence before making assumptions about defendants. The court clerk's office created a help desk specifically to assist people who couldn't afford legal representation. 3 months after her court appearance, Sarah stood at a podium in City Hall, addressing a room full of city officials and community leaders. Her voice was still soft, but it carried authority earned through dedication and intelligence. The changes we've seen are encouraging, she told the audience, but our work isn't finished. Every system needs people who are willing to question it, to examine it carefully, and to speak up when they find problems, even if their voice shakes when they do so. The Mensa Society featured Sarah's story in their national newsletter, highlighting how high intelligence could be used to serve community needs. But Sarah remained focused on her local impact, continuing to tutor children and volunteer at the legal aid clinic. As she prepared to graduate high school that spring, Sarah received acceptance letters from several prestigious law schools. Each one cited her traffic court case as an example of the kind of analytical thinking and commitment to justice they sought in their students. Judge Harrison, who had become one of Sarah's strongest advocates, wrote her primary letter of recommendation. In it, he wrote, "Ms. Jenkins taught me the most valuable lesson of my judicial career, that justice wears no particular face and speaks in no particular volume. It requires only a clear mind and a determined spirit." The final statistics told a powerful story. Over 400 citations were reviewed and dismissed, resulting in nearly $60,000 in refunded fines. More importantly, the rate of citations at malfunctioning signals dropped to near zero as repair times improved across all neighborhoods. Sarah's quiet revolution had created lasting change. As she sat in her bedroom one evening, looking at her college acceptance letters, she smiled at the framed copy of her dismissed citation hanging on the wall, a reminder that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest voices. The story of the quiet girl who transformed a traffic court became part of local legal lore, taught to new judges and lawyers as an example of how justice should work. But for Sarah, it was just the beginning. She knew there were other systems that needed examination, other voices that needed amplification, and other quiet revolutionaries waiting for their moment to speak.